The farmer protests in Europe is continuing to spread and escalate. In Spain, for example, there were clashes between the farmers and the police. The conflict occurred as the protesters, consisting of farmers and truck drivers, attempted to access the main road with the intention of blocking it. The protesters were represented by two groups, Plataforma Nacional, which represents truck drivers, and a newly created farmers group, Plataforma 6F. These groups had decided to join forces and protest together against what they perceive as unfair environmental protection rules that makes them less competitive compared to other regions. The protesters, who were waving Spanish flags, wearing yellow vests, and shouting Viva España, had gathered in a car park near the Atlético de Madrid stadium. After voting in favor of uniting their efforts, hundreds of these protesters proceeded to walk around the stadium and then try to access the main highway. However, the police clashed with these protesters as they tried to block the road. And then later, a group of around 200 protesters tried to gather outside the headquarters of Spain's ruling Socialist Party, but a large police presence prevented them from getting too close. Manuel Hernandez, head of the Plataforma Nacional, representing truck drivers, was quoted as saying this about the incident. He said, "The government is forcing us to take measures that will mean products will unfortunately not get to consumers in time. That is why we are calling on politicians to take responsibility and do something." Now, both groups are vowing to keep protesting in Madrid and across the country until their demands are met. And this incident in Madrid is part of the series of protests that have been occurring across Spain, where farmers have been expressing their discontent with EU policies, the impact of drought and the war in Ukraine, and rising production costs. The protests have involved blocking several highways and ports, and in some instances there have been reports of protesters throwing rocks at police officers and police deploying riot control measures. And now the farmer protests against these Orwellian environmental regulations that are not only crushing the industry, but will almost certainly lead to greater food insecurity, which is just a nice way of saying people are going to starve with their planned reduction in agricultural output, have now spread across the pond and have finally reached the UK. On February 10th, British farmers conducted an impromptu tractor demonstration in the port town of Dover to protest against foreign imports of food. The protests was a response to the challenges faced by local farmers, including competition from cheaper foreign markets and the impact on their livelihoods. Kent police responded to the incident involving slow-moving vehicles on Jubilee Way, which is one of the main roads leading to the port. The police worked alongside Port of Dover police to manage the situation. Jeffrey Gibson, a farmer from Yew Tree Farm in Wingham, Kent, took to social media to explain his participation in the protest. He pointed out that the supermarkets were selling British produce at prices lower than the cost of production. He mentioned that about 30 tractors had gathered on roads around the port, but were dispersed as the police had blocked many of the roads, preventing them from getting near the port. And he expressed that the protest aimed to raise awareness of the unfair treatment of farmers and warned that these protests would only escalate to the level of those seen in Paris and Brussels unless the government took notice. The UK farmers' demonstration is aligning with the growing wave of protests all across Europe. Farmers are finally having enough and are voicing their concerns about EU farming policies, environmental regulations, and economic pressures. While the UK is no longer part of the EU, the British farmers are still facing similar pressure from overbearing regulations and are now seeming to show solidarity with their European counterparts by staging their own protests. So where are we now with the farmer protest in the UK and in Europe? Well, as of today, February 12th, the farmer protests in the European Union have seen significant developments. The protests, as we've been discussing, have spread across Europe, including the United Kingdom, and have resulted in some concessions to EU policies. The European Commission has decided to scrap a plan to halve pesticide use and has omitted the agricultural sector from their strict timeline for cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 90% before 2040. The EU's Agricultural Commissioner expressed satisfaction with these changes, stating that they were not fully fair and that the solution is to provide more financial subsidies to incentivize farmers to pursue greener practices. However, the EU is continuing to march on with their intention of enacting their climate regime upon the citizens of the bloc, even if they can't yet crush the farmers. As The Guardian had reported, under a landmark proposal laid out by its executive body, the bloc will have to pump 90% less gas into the air by 2040 than it did in 1990, a figure which includes the carbon it removes from the atmosphere. The target is at the bottom end of the 90 to 95% net cuts that the EU scientific watchdog recommended in June, and meeting it would require a much faster shift to a clean economy. The EU's 27 member states cut their emissions by just 30%, according to the European Environment Agency, leaving them half as long to do twice the work. The Guardian article goes on to say that the final document no longer refers to cutting agricultural emissions of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas belched out by cows, or nitrogen, a pollutant in fertilizer and manure that reacts to form heat-trapping gases. The text instead states that its purpose is to launch the political debate. It does not propose a new policy measure or set new sector-specific targets. Now, this last bit just means that they're going to try to retool and come back at a later date to come after these farmers. The longer this goes on and the more Orwellian restrictions the EU places upon its citizens in the name of climate religion, the harder it will be for people to push back later, which may be why the protests are soldiering on. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. When we're talking about cow belching as a problem, are we serious? Life on Earth is bad for the Earth. I mean, what are we talking about here? Anyway, in Italy, Spain, and Poland, the farmers have continued the demonstrations against the EU farming policies and are demanding reduced profits and unfair competition from non-EU countries. These protests have spread despite the concessions made by the European Commission. In Poland, for example, the farmers are particularly concerned about the impact of the cheap grain imports from the Ukraine, which have caused prices to fall 40% in 2023. And the protests are expected to continue on over the coming weeks, with a major protest being organized in the Italian capital for February 21st. And by the way, worth noting here, these farmer protests have also become a politically charged issue. There's an upcoming EU parliamentary election in June. And because of these protests, there is fear that more right-wing lawmakers might make their way into the parliament. The protests are seen as a prelude to further clashes and are set to dominate the electoral competition ahead of the European Parliament 2024 elections, which I say is a good thing. These current members of the European Parliament have been left unchecked for too long. What is happening in the EU, and now starting in the UK, was an inevitable reaction to the climate agenda. The plans made by these people, these green climate zealots, were always going to end up destroying the economic fortunes of the average citizen. The vibrant freedoms enjoyed by the West are directly tied to so-called fossil fuels. And it won't just end with the farmers. Everyone will feel the grip of these people if they get their way in reducing their emissions by 90%. What happens next? Well, only time is going to tell, but as always here on this channel, we'll be keeping an eye on the situation as it continues to develop. And that, my friends, will bring this episode to a close once more. From the Topical Umbrella, I am Adrian. Thanks for watching. See you all next time.